found themselves and in which they found the Muslims, that of a civilization that was on the defensive in the face of this aggressive and vigorous Western civilization that was in the process of dominating the world. And in the next generation, give or take, you had this Muslim activist response to that interpretation of Islam, which was to say, wait a minute, no. This apologeticism that Islam is in line with this dominant worldview. This dominant worldview is basically correct. It works, and Islam can work as part of it. There was a rejection of that, and this project was proposed that let's get Islamic civilization back to its foundations. That there's something wrong with that Western civilization, and that Islam has the answer not only for the Muslims but for the world as a whole. And the interpretation of Islam that they wanted to promote was one that was very textually based, and yet at the same time it had a certain departure from traditional interpretations, in that it really highlighted Islam as an ideology. The 20th century and the 19th century as well was a period of ideologies. It had socialism, communism, all the isms of the modern era. And so they sort of turned Islam into Islamism. Although those movements and other Islamic movements have had a tremendous impact upon Muslim societies in creating this urge to find that Islamic identity and make it something that is expressed in public life. That approach has had a big impact upon Muslims in general and Muslim societies. However, the basic idea of this elite vanguard movement taking control of the state and then Islamizing the society from the top down, basically it hasn't worked. And in fact, the Egyptian experiment or the approach in specific and the Arab experience in general has been that attempts to oppose those secular governments and vie with them for political power, it has further entrenched those regimes and caused a hardening of positions that has more forcefully excluded Islam in some ways from any hope of influencing the higher echelons of government. So that's on one level. Now, on another level, I mean, we still see that the Western powers, although they have, as Sayyid Qutb and others observed, they have left the Muslim countries, apparently, those that they've left behind are carrying on with their agenda, and that on the world stage, the West is still very dominant, and even those rising powers that might challenge them, such as China, their ideology shares many of the same starting points as the Westerners, because China was ruled for a long time by a Marxist ideology, And then after Mao Zedong died, although they still paid lip service to Marxism, they basically imported a capitalist model, a kind of state capitalism, but still with a tremendous emphasis upon certain starting points of atheist philosophy, etc. So now the point is that dominant non-Muslim system in the world, it hasn't gone away, and it's not showing any signs of going away soon. So, and that Islamist attempt to turn back the tide, especially in the Muslim countries, hasn't really done what it set out to do. I mean, the goals that those movements set for themselves, they haven't really achieved them. So at this point, there's another kind of looking around and saying, well, if that didn't work, then what next? So one of the major trends in the 20th century has been really to continue with that ideology or that inclination that was pioneered by Zayd Ahmed Khan and Muhammad Aboo. And one of the major practitioners of that in the 20th century was Fazlur-Rahmaan. He wrote a book called Islam and Modernity, in which he really focused on the whole issue of reinterpreting the texts of the Qur'an and the Sunnah. And as I mentioned earlier, he pretty much accepted the Orientalist position of people like Joseph Schacht and Goldzahir, that the Sunnah was largely fabricated by ulama, and that it really represented the crystallization of customs that were present among the Arabs in that early Islamic era, after the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and that they backdated those positions by manufacturing isnads to attribute them to an earlier era. So Fazlur-Rahmaan, basically he bought that thesis, and so he really downplays the role of the Sunnah altogether. And you'll see that all of the people that we will look at today, that they do basically the same thing with the Sunnah. And so then the focus of their approach becomes, how do you interpret the Qur'an? So that book by Fazlur-Rahmaan, Islam and Modernity, is in its early, the first part of the book is very, very focused on hermeneutics. Now hermeneutics has a slightly different meaning than exegesis. It has very much a consciousness of taking a look at events and texts from the past and interpreting them for a contemporary generation in a way that makes those texts meaningful to the contemporary generation. And hermeneutics, especially as it's understood in this generation that we're living in, puts a tremendous emphasis on the fact that there's no such thing as objectivity. Everybody has a point of view. And when you start talking about interpreting a text, the first order of business is to put your cards on the table. This is where I'm coming from. This is the baggage I'm carrying, because the baggage I'm carrying will, for sure, influence my understanding of the text. And then I come to the text with certain preconceptions. I encounter the text, and then through the filter of my understanding, I derive meaning from the text. And some of that meaning will then, if someone is honest, will affect the worldview of the interpreter. They make an adjustment in order to accommodate the text, and then it's a sort of a back and forth with the text. Each time you read it, then you get something new out of it, and it's this back and forth between where you're coming from and what the text is saying. So that's the real hallmark of this postmodernism. Okay, now one of the other aspects of postmodernism, this whole idea of deconstruction, that everything can be explained away, basically, and texts are seen as the product of an era, and they have their historical influences, environmental influences, and you need to identify those and sort of peel away the layers of influence. And actually what happens when you peel away all those layers is there's basically nothing left. And so then when you want to put it back together again, you put it together with your layers of social context. And so they very much have this idea that there really isn't an objective meaning to these texts, that the meaning is created by the observer. And of course, that's very convenient if you want to just completely reinterpret something about which there has been a consensus in the past. And now another feature of postmodernity and the whole approach of those theorists is that they're skeptical of what they call grand narratives. So the Bible had a big story that people believed in and that gave meaning to their lives. And the Qur'an has a big story that gives meaning to people's lives. And that these big stories, these grand narratives, that they are just the product of particular cultures and the concerns of those people, and that there is no such thing as an objective reality that these grand narratives are grounded in. They're just basically products of the human mind. And people end up killing each other based upon the internal logic of their particular tribal stories. And so there is a cause in all of that human history to be wary of these grand narratives because they end up getting people to do terrible things. So this is at the very end of this whole process that we're going to be talking about. That's where a lot of the non-Muslim thinkers have reached, and there are contemporary Muslim thinkers who are heavily influenced by those people, and they have adopted their tools of criticism and approaching the texts. So when you use those tools and some of those assumptions, then you end up with a lot of the same conclusions.